There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
You are listening to a Rankandfile.ca podcast. Rankandfile.ca is a website dedicated to providing labor news and analysis for rebuilding trade unions and the workers' movement from below. We start our Unifor interview series with Bruce Allen. Bruce Allen attended the founding convention of Unifor at the end of August in Toronto. Bruce is Vice President of Unifor Local 199, formerly CAW, and Vice President of the Niagara Regional Labor Council. At the Unifor Convention, you nominated Lindsay as president, and she won 17.5% of the vote. Can you tell us why you did that and how the campaign came about?
Okay, well, I'll give you a little bit of the run-up, which defines why, what we were up against. First of all, Willie Lambert was already running. He'd already had material widely circulated on Facebook. And then about 3 days approximately before the convention, a posting came on Facebook that he was withdrawing his nomination. And just prior to that, Lindsay and I had been talking. We'd talked a little bit on and off for a while about both being delegates to the convention and whether we'd do something there, because we're longtime associates in terms of being vocal opponents of the concessionary course of the CAW in recent years, particularly in the auto industry. She's a Ford worker and I'm a GM worker. Anyway, so just prior to with Willie running, we were discussing what we were going to do, and we'd made a decision that we were going to nominate. I was going to nominate her to run against Peter Kennedy for Secretary Treasurer. And then suddenly we find out, like about 3 days before the convention, that Willie was withdrawing. So we figure out, well, what do we do now? It didn't make a lot of sense to run for Secretary Treasurer and leave the vacant president's position unchallenged. And it's the one that would get the attention. So in a virtual last-minute decision, we decide, okay, well, do you want she'll run for president, right? Which really put us in a box in terms of time constraints, plus the fact that, you're only talking about 2 people doing this. I mean, our combined resources, now both of us are pretty resourceful individuals, but still it's only 2 people against the machine like the CAW National Union. So we had less than 3 days to put together a campaign. I had already a few days prior written out a draft of statement of what she could stand for, and then she took that, liked it, and made some changes to it. And then so that's about all that had been done prior to that point in terms of preliminary work. And then, as I indicated, the preliminary work was initially done on the presumption she was running for Secretary Treasurer. So we had to scramble a bit, and we reconfigured everything to run for president. And so what I did was I scrambled together some thoughts about what I would say in terms of nominating her, and then she took the material we'd produced and made a leaflet. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to get French translation done. But we did get the leaflet done, and we just tabletoped that at the convention at the lunch hour just prior to the vote. The National had an inclination for quite some time that I was likely to be up to something, but they expect that of me. Anyway, but there was no clear idea of what, in terms of Lindsay running for president. That was probably as much of a surprise to them as it was to us. But one thing that happened that was real interesting, and it may have been, the National pulling the strings, because Gary Beck, the president of her local, night before the convention, he phoned up the president of my local, trying to get him to talk me out of nominating her, right? So there was an attempt to kind of scuttle the election before it even happened, much like the election before, Willie Lambert was going to run one other time, and it never got to a vote. But anyway, so that's what happened. There was just two of us. We had less than 3 days. We didn't even know prior to then that we would run her for president. So we were, as David Camfield said, it was a shoestring operation. That's no exaggeration. And we were up against the what I refer to as the Leviathan in terms of the all-powerful apparatus of the National Union, combined with reinforced by the apparatus from CEP.
What was the effect at the convention that you saw of Lindsay running? Was it positive, negative? How did it play out?
It wasn't immediately discernible. There was it just kind of one thing after another gained momentum. But the real turning point was after I nominated her, and Dave Cole, the president of CEP, was arguing arguing negatively against calls from the floor to allow both candidates to speak. And when the floor managed to succeed in forcing him to back down on that, and as a result, Lindsay got 5 minutes to speak to the convention, as well as Dias, and Dias clearly wasn't prepared to have to do that, which is kind of entertaining. That was the real turning point in terms of this thing developing, and then she handled herself at the microphone really well, considering she didn't have any prepared text or had no certain idea that she was going to ever speak to the convention. So she just did it off the cuff, and she did, considering that, she did real well.
You used the word patriarchy when nominating Lindsay. Why?
For quite some time in the CAW, they've made a lot of there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of talk about fighting against violence against women, and that has happened particularly around annual events commemorating the Montreal Massacre. And I have gone to the mic at what used to be CAW Council once or twice around that, and basically challenged the National Union, telling them, in effect, saying that if violence against women is really going to be addressed, then we have to basically face head on the question of patriarchy. And for me, that was in a kind of unique kind of way. It's a wedge issue, because I know full well that the people at the very top of the CAW, the ones with real power, are predominantly white males, and that even though they have a lot of women in relatively high positions, and it gives the appearance of reasonable gender equity and some equity in terms of workers of color, the real power brokers are older white males. So it is, in a very real sense, when you pull back the curtain, it is an old boys club. And certainly, if you look at the top two officers from throughout the entire history of the Union, the top two officers have all been older white men. And the highest a woman ever got was executive assistant to the president. And there was a situation a few years ago when Loenza got elected where Carol Phillips was going to challenge for the secretary-treasurer, and Buzz basically orchestrated to suppress that candidacy and never came to an election, and she became a non-person, was gone from staff not long afterwards, and became a non-person within the union. But anyway, I brought up patriarchy because I know this history, and I know the reality of the CAW that their talk about equity issues, their talk about violence against women is to a large degree facile. that there's no substantive analysis and critique of society that backs it up. And it's kind of like just an appeal to morality almost with regard to violence against women, that it's unacceptable, yada, yada, yada. But no analysis of the underlying causes, and certainly no addressing the fact that gender inequality and patriarchy lie at the root of violence against women, and no analysis of what that means in terms of what would flow from that in terms of the changes that should take place in organizations and society at large as a way of addressing those issues. And so patriarchy for me has always been a kind of a wedge issue, where I saw it was kind of like an underbelly for the labor movement, particularly for the CAW, in terms of it in practical terms not living out the reality falling far short of the rhetoric. And so for me, that was the way. Bringing up patriarchy is one of the ways in which, in effect, I've tried to push a more radical agenda within the labor movement, and push what could be called transformative demands, and what could be in terms of and as I said in my presentation nominating Lindsay, I mean, the whole concept for me is the concept that you've got to start to be the reality, live the and exemplify the reality of what you want to be. And so my argument is that the CAW wants to be a vehicle for promoting gender equity and the end of violence against women in society, then it should embody in practical terms, in terms of its own functioning, in terms of its own organization, a culture that is synonymous with achieving that goal. And as I said, the practical reality comes nowhere near meeting the rhetoric.
How would you compare your experience at this convention to CAW conventions?
This convention was very different. This convention was marked I've repeatedly referred to what happening and what we achieved at this convention as a democratic opening. I like to quote a guy who died a few years ago, you might remember him, Joe Flexer. He used to use a term about the bureaucracy and the labor movement and how they like to try and control things, and every so often they don't manage to control it. And he said there's an outbreak of democracy. Well, I see it in those kind of terms. The difference is this: 28 years of the CAW, there had never been a contested election for president. Never. Let alone a seriously contested election for president. And the whole, despite all the rhetoric about it being so thoroughly democratic and a kind of a symbol of democracy, exemplifying democracy, all the rest of that, the reality is quite the contrary. Aside from the fact that the election process has always been virtually completely rigged. The reality is that the top leadership has had total control of the organization at the national level. And the one thing I always referred to in that respect is the last time at CW council meetings, the national president would always come forward with several recommendations that would set out policy for the union. Well, the last time one of those recommendations was defeated was 1992, which means the president has gotten his way on every single issue before the body through all those years. For over 20 years, there wasn't a single time that the president recommended a policy position that was not essentially rubber stamped by the delegates to the council. So, I mean, the whole thing was just a facade of democracy rather than a practical living example of democracy. And there were some issues along the way where there was considerable opposition among the delegates to a policy, but as soon as any significant opposition would emerge, the National Union would mobilize its apparatus, particularly its staff, to suppress it and contain it. There were a number of examples of this. There was a lot of opposition to taking a hard line against Bob Ray during the fight against the social contract. The older workers, the retirees, wanted to remain loyal to the NDP. There was significant opposition to that, but they managed to suppress it. Another example was the Magna Agreement. There was a lot of opposition to the Magna Agreement, but they managed to mobilize, and when it came to a vote, the delegates ratified, endorsed the Magna Agreement by about an 80% margin. And another one where they encountered a lot of opposition unfortunately, was gun control. But while the opposition was pretty powerful then, I mean, they might have got 30 or 40% of the votes. When all was said and done, the National Union managed to prevail and have its policy upheld. So there's a total lack throughout all those years of meaningful democracy within the organization. And so this convention was a departure from that because, one, the mere fact that we forced a genuinely democratic election was unprecedented. Another thing, at the very end of the convention, delegates from CEP started to challenge the chair on procedural issues, and they really rattled Dias on that, and that never happened in the CAW. I mean, you just never saw anything like that. I was quite taken back by it. Whether they had legitimate criticisms of what Dias was doing or not is not the point. The point is they challenged him. But the one thing they did challenge him on was that when a person would speak at the mic on an issue, rather than just go to the next speaker, Dias would intervene and respond to that person. So he was in effect engaging in interventions at the mic, at a mic, out of place and contrary to what he should have been done, which is chair of the meeting, officiate the people, the order of speakers. And another thing that happened that was real interesting, and I attribute this entirely to Lindsay's candidacy and the things we said. I've never seen this. This was astonishing. I swear, during the final day, when it came to people being recognized at the mic, Jerry Dias actually started to practice gender parity. That if a woman was at the mic, rather than wait for several men, he would recognize the woman next instead of having 3 or 4 men go ahead of her. And I've never seen that at a convention, even CLCO fell nowhere. I've never seen that kind of exercise of gender parity in terms of who speaks at a convention. And I thought that was terrific. I thought that the fact that he was doing that in response to what we did was a tremendous thing in terms of promoting in a very practical way gender parity, because I've always believed very strongly in practicing gender parity in recognition of speakers, because it has an effect upon the dynamic of the way discussion and debate unfolds, and I found it to be a very positive experience. But for me to have seen this at a convention just blew me away, and I was really pleased. And I don't believe for a second that ever would have happened if it wasn't for what me and Lindsay had done.
Unifor has also developed something called community chapters, and there was a section of the convention dedicated to it. How do you see the community chapters?
I see it as a good idea. I mean, the labor movement's got to open itself up to a broader participation by working class people and the oppressed. And so I see it conceptually, it's a real good thing. And my only source of skepticism about that is whether we'll see it actually unfold in practical terms. And the problem there is that the initiative for doing that is going to lie at the level of the local unions. And I don't know, or I'm not convinced that there will be a lot of local unions that will take that kind of initiative on their own. I think the only way that can conceivably even begin to be translated into action and actually become a practical reality is if the national union really pushes it from the top, because unfortunately the culture of the CAW, I don't know about the CEP in this respect because I'm still not that familiar with the CEP. Fortunately, the culture of the CAW was such that the national union will really have to put out a call and seriously push locals into action around issues. There's a culture, such a top-down culture, that you would never see locals on their own take initiative. Rarely ever see locals on their own take initiatives and engage in campaigns or any kind of efforts on their own unless they knew it was sanctioned by the national union. And that was, that whole dynamic was just characteristic of the extremely hierarchical nature of the CAW and how power was effectively concentrated at the very top. Meaning in a sense that if Ken Loenza sent a letter to the locals saying, "Oh, you should all get out and support the healthcare rally that's taking place 2 weeks from today," then you would see people show up. You would see the president, the executive, all trying to get some people out there. But if there was no absent such correspondence, it's entirely possible nobody would show up.
There's also a section on organizing. There's a lot of talk about $10 million going into it. Do you have any sense of what sort of money that is compared to what the CAW is putting into organizing?
I think they're serious about trying to organize more people, and I think I genuinely believe that they're genuine in seeing this the formation of this new union as a potential conduit for more effective organizing efforts. But so I think they mean it. How this is going to unfold on the ground is really going to be the acid test. But in terms of their intentions, I think they really mean it, and they mean it as an organization. They want it, they need it, they have to have it in order to be effective. In order if they want to become the powerhouse that they say they want to become, and I have no doubt that they'd love to be. There needs to be stepped up efforts to organize. But coupled with that, and here's where I see a problem. Coupled with that, I see a problem, and that is there's been no serious effort in terms of mass action, building potent campaigns around making changes to labor laws. A lot of rhetoric comes and goes about that. But if there isn't a real serious fight for card certification across the board, if there isn't a real serious fight for anti-scab legislation, and I would add to that list plant closure legislation, because the threat of plant closures is always the most potent weapon an employer has in threatening workers who want to organize. If there isn't a real serious threat to get labor law changes that realizes things we need in those three respects, that's going to be a huge obstacle to any real progress in terms of major organizing efforts. The sad reality is, the ugly reality is that the quality of the kind of labor legislation that's in place has a huge impact in terms of the ability to organize larger numbers of workers, and I think Quebec exemplifies that. I think there's a direct relationship between the fact that there's better labor legislation in Quebec and the fact that a much larger proportion of the workforce in Quebec is organized.
You're talking about labor legislation. Last year you wrote a reflection on the merger discussing the different political alliances and strategies of the CAW and CEP.
That issue is completely unresolved, and what has evidently happened is that they couldn't come to a consensus on that, so they basically took it off the table and left it out there hanging. and said, well, we'll go ahead and merge and we'll figure it out afterwards. In fact, last December, I challenged a CAW council. I challenged Ken Lowenza at the mic on that issue, and his answer was instructive. I mean, he wasn't hostile. He basically said that we'll have consultations after the merger takes place. We'll have consultations with the membership on this issue. But he said that at one moment. In the next moment, he was really ramping up his defense of the CAW's policy of strategic voting. So they got a real problem there. Nothing's been done in terms of trying to address that issue. And I think, and I felt all along that is going to be a real source of internal friction within this new union. And one other thing that happened in that convention that reinforced my view of that. Many of the young, more militant CEP delegates, it turns out, were CEP delegates who work on parliamentary staff, and they predominantly work, of course, for parliamentary staff of New Democrats. Those young people, they are pretty left-wing. The one woman of color who got up at the mic and took them on over the fact that the new National Executive Board had so few people of color on it, she's an example. I spoke to Malcolm Allen, he used to be from my local, about her, and he said that that's where she worked. She worked on the staff of somewhere in Parliament in Ottawa, and he said of the people who do that job in Oshawa, he said they're all like that. Well, if they're all like that, and they're predominantly working for New Democrats, well, I see that as a real potential bastion of opposition to an embrace of strategic voting, which would mean, in practical terms, often supporting the Liberals. And I think that's an issue they're going to have trouble with. At some point, their preoccupation is to try and turn their heads and act like it's not there, but it's the white elephant in the room, and at some point they're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to be very interesting to see how things unfold. I know that within CAW, about 10 years ago, there was a small left caucus, and I was basically the person that initiated it. And the people in that left caucus were basically an amalgam of left New Democrats and people to the left of the NDP. And while we couldn't agree on, there was obvious disagreement on whether to support the NDP or not, we did reach agreement on opposition to strategic voting. And we reached up, and the common thread that the basis for our common position was that we saw the embrace of strategic voting as an abandonment of class politics in terms of the CAW's political strategy, and we had some success at least in terms of at least manifesting visible opposition to the direction Buzz Hargrove was taking us, and I think that I'm convinced at some point you're going to see a similar bubbling up from the base of the councils or convention on that issue, and those younger members of CEP are definitely going to be a source of it, because as my article clearly states, the whole history of CEP, his affiliation with the NDP. Will combine that with the fact that you have these younger, more militant people who work as staff in NDP offices, and they're not gonna sit back and take it in terms of if Dias and those guys try and ram strategic voting down their throats.
Now that the convention is over, how best do you think members can keep this democratic opening open?
That's a hard question to answer, because we don't know when the various councils and other bodies of the new union are going to start to meet, and who's going to be there. Until I see that, it's hard for me to answer that. And because in practical terms, the networking and the informal discussions that are going to take place at those bodies between people who are the more vocally critical of the national leadership. That's the way in which this stuff is going to be manifested, and it's going to be manifested at those bodies, because I don't see it happening at the local unions or at the base in terms of the shop floor. Not at all, because the shop floor is the prevalent reality on the shop floor is a complete disinterest in politics, in the union's involvement in politics.
Do you see any prospect of putting together something like the Left Caucus?
It could happen. It could happen. It really is too early to tell in terms of whether that's going to be possible. Again, until I start going to these various councils and conventions of the new union and see who's there and who's inclined to do what, I won't be able to gauge that. But if there's a sufficient body of discontent within those bodies, I'll certainly do what I can to facilitate communication and networking among the people involved.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts on the convention and Unifor?
The way I guess I could sum it up is that I went into this prior to this convention, I had a very negative view of this merger, although I didn't oppose it because I had such expected so little of it. But I'm much more positive about the merger now and about the possibilities that it could open up because of what we achieved at that convention in terms of the democratic opening, in terms of the willingness of a significant number of delegates to challenge the leadership, and it's not, and because it's just generally internally more democratic. I mean, there were things that happened there that, as I've indicated, never happened at CAW Council or CAW conventions, and consequently, I'm happy with. I'm fairly positive about it. With a lot, of course, tentatively so, because so much remains to be seen. But I'm fairly positive about it because I see this as a more democratic organization in which people who want to pursue a militant course and want to take on the capital's onslaught against labor more seriously can push their views. Promote their views and put pressure on the leadership to do things.
You've been listening to a Rankandfile.ca podcast. Check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.